This weekend we get the opportunity to examine the evidence, to look at the creation-evolution controversy. Tonight we're going to look at the question of, is there a God? And I want us to start by talking a little bit about what happens to a society that basically gives up a belief in God. What happens to a society that turns its back on a God? What happens to a society that closes God out of the classroom? We'll start at Washington State, where just a few short months ago, a 13-year-old boy went to school complaining about his parents taking him to church too much. Counselor said, we can do something about that. They called Child Protective Services. He was removed from his home, and the only way the parents got the young man back was by agreeing to only attend worship services for 1 hour a week. But that's literally just the tip of the iceberg. A couple of weeks while you were sleeping on a Wednesday night, our Congress passed a new bill known as H.R. 1913. Now, you all have probably heard it called the Hate Speech Crime Bill. And that sounds like a good thing. You don't want somebody being hateful. And it is a good thing until you read the vague language of this bill and you find out that it is giving preferential treatment to homosexuals and to pedophiles. In fact, it is going to make it extremely hard for a preacher to get up in a pulpit like this one and preach and teach what this book has to say on those topics. Now, folks, I want you to get that for just a moment. We are on the cusp of passing legislation for the first time in our nation's history that is going to make it against the law to preach and teach the whole counsel of God. But again, that's just the hem of the garment. A couple of short months ago, Colorado passed a new law. It's in the books. My wife is actually there right now. In the state of Colorado, you build a new building, say a coffee shop or a restaurant. By law, you must now offer gender-neutral bathrooms. Now, folks, think about that for just a moment. These are restrooms where males and females use the same facility at the same time. You see, Colorado is one of the states, the leading states for transgender operations, sex change operations. They didn't know which restroom to go to. So they petitioned the court. The court said, you're absolutely right. We're going to level the playing field. Now, let's say you look at that and you think, man, that's not right. There's a problem with that. I wouldn't do that. I mean, I don't want some 60-year-old man falling behind a 5-year-old little girl. Well, folks, if you don't do it, there's a $5,000 fine and up to a year in prison. And you say, Brad, they can't do this. This is the United States of America. Folks, we're already doing it. The great state of Maine is one of those states that is helping forge the way. They've actually taken their locker rooms. Their locker rooms are now gender neutral. In fact, if you look very carefully right here at the bottom, they're starting all the way down preschool and nursery. And yet we shouldn't be surprised. California actually led the way. They removed several of the little boys, the little girls sign from their restrooms in their school districts. So now little boys and girls are using the same facility at the same time. Now you ask the obvious question, why would they do this? They give two reasons. Number one, they say they don't want to give any child an advantage over another child. But number two, they say they don't want to force a gender identity onto any of those children before they're ready. Now, this would be the same state that cannot physically make up its mind when it comes to the topic of same-sex marriage. You know, we hear about this occasionally in the news, but have you really stopped to think about where we are on this? Let's have a real quick review. Let's go all the way back to the year 2003, where the great state of Massachusetts was the very first to legalize it. Now, most of you in here probably know that. But here's what you may not know. You know, while Greece and Rome allowed same-sex marriage even in their empires, guess who was the first nation to legalize it? We were. That's not exactly something to be proud of, is it? You then turn to Connecticut in the year 2003, the state of Iowa, 2009, Maine, Vermont, New Hampshire. Those of you who are keeping track, you know, earlier this month, New York. That's 8 states, friends. 8 states in our union, that's more than a tenth of our nation, has legalized an abomination to God. Let's think about something for just a moment. How many times have we heard people say, God bless America? And yet, my question to you this evening as we start out on this very critical topic is, should God bless America? And by that I mean this. You realize all I've known my entire life is legalized abortion. That's all I've ever known. In fact, you add to that, we're now legalizing same-sex marriage, and you look at what we're putting on primetime television at night, folks. Listen to me. There's some garbage on there that used to be considered R-rated movies. And that's just the commercials. We have forgotten that sin separates us from God. Isaiah chapter 59 verse 2, your iniquities have separated you from your God. Your sins have hidden His face from you so that He will not hear. If you brought a Bible tonight, let me encourage you to open it up to Psalm chapter 14 verse 1. That's where we're going to kind of lay the foundation for the discussion of God. Psalm chapter 14 verse 1. The fool has said in his heart, there is no God. Now, most of you in here have heard that verse, but that's usually where we stop. Tonight I want you to look at what the entire verse says. It goes on to say, they are corrupt, they have done, and I want everybody in this room to notice this word right here. They've done abominable works. There is none who does good. So the psalmist is telling us that atheists, those who have absolutely no belief in a God, are doing abominable works. If I asked you tonight, do we see that played out in our nation today? I mean, do we see abominable works from atheists in this nation? Let's take a look. Last year, my home state, Lebanon, Tennessee, there was a group of parents that were getting together every single morning, praying for their kids. One of the kids went home, told his dad's an atheist, didn't like it, sued the school system, $171,000 later, they had to disband. Or we could talk about another teacher. Teacher who gave an assignment to high school students. She told them, she said, I want you to write a research paper giving at least 4 references. Now, some of the students wrote about things like witchcraft, some wrote about reincarnation. One young lady by the name of Brittany Settle, she decided she would write her paper on the life of Jesus Christ. She gave her 4 sources, and yet because of her topic, she got a 0. We go to Toledo, Ohio. Brand new elementary school was built to the tune of millions of taxpayer dollars, and then it was cosmetically changed because they were afraid these right here would offend folks in the community. How about this one? Some of you may remember several years ago, Montgomery, Alabama. Chief Justice Roy Moore was told to get those 10 commandments out of his courtroom. You remember that? My wife and I, we actually lived in Montgomery at the time, and I promise you it was a circus. Now, let me make sure everybody in here understands. I recognize that we are under a new covenant. Praise God. But you know what? Realistically, I don't have a problem with the 10 commandments. In fact, it's in this book. It's part of His inspired word, right? And in fact, I think there's probably people in this community and my community all over the United States that can learn something from it. Here's what I bet most of you don't know. The exact same week that Chief Justice Roy Moore was being told to get those 10 commandments out of the courtroom, our nation was putting into place a new plaque honoring the gay, lesbian, bisexual, and transgender veterans killed in action. Now, folks, I want you to get that for just a moment. At the same time we're removing the Ten Commandments, we're putting into place a plaque that's honoring the sin of homosexuality. That's wicked, folks. We go to Denver again, where an elementary school principal walks into the library, and of all the books removed, guess which one he takes out? The Bible. I was in Alaska a few months ago. Was doing a meeting. I normally don't ever do meetings through the week, but I was up there. I was doing a meeting Sunday to Wednesday. So I preached all day Sunday. Monday evening, I was setting up my computer, and a 16-year-old young man, he came forward. He said, "Dr. Harrub, you were right." So what's that? He said, "I went to our school library today." He said, "I found all kind of books on Wicca." He said, "I found books on Satan worship and the occult, but I couldn't find a Bible." He said, "I went to our school librarian and I just asked her, 'Where's the Bible?' He said, she looked me in the face and said, 'That book is not allowed here.'" Now, folks, think about that for just a moment. Everybody in this room who is over the age of 20, every single one of you recognize a suburb of Denver, Colorado. You may have never seen it. You may have never driven through it. But if I mention the name Columbine to you, does it ring a bell? We go to Houston, Texas. Houston, Texas, where two sisters are walking down the hallway carrying a Bible. Teacher spots them. She rebukes them. She actually took them to the principal's office. And folks, in my day, you go to the principal's office, that was a pretty serious offense. She called their mom, wanted to call Child Protective Services. When mom shows up, she takes the Bible, throws it into the trash can saying, "This is garbage." How about this one? Anybody in here remember 9/11? We mark time by it, don't we? Those of you who fly on airplanes, you know just how drastically things have changed. But again, here's something that I bet some of you don't remember. 3 or 4 weeks after 9/11, after those Muslim terrorists took airplanes and they flew them into our World Trade Center, the state of California was adopting a new textbook called Across the Centuries. A textbook that is working its way east. It's in that particular textbook that the students are forced to engage in Muslim rituals such as praying to Allah, fasting in the Islamic month of Ramadan. In fact, during this period, the students were told, "You and your classmates will become Muslim." And yet the psalmist said, "Blessed is the man who walks not in the counsel of the ungodly." I want us to take just a minute or two to walk back in history and look what happens to a nation that turns its back on God. A nation that says there is no God. A nation that basically says, you know what, maybe we evolved from some ape-like creature. If you've got your Bibles, turn and look with me at the end of the book of Deuteronomy. Let's learn a little something from history. You remember at the end of the book of Deuteronomy, Moses is dying. He's not allowed to go into the land of milk and honey. Why? God said, "You speak to the rock." What did Moses do? He struck it. He said, "You know, last time I whacked it, it worked." And for that one act of disobedience and arrogance, he didn't get to go. We find the end of the book of Deuteronomy then turning leadership over to a guy named Joshua. So if you look, you flip the page, you're now in Joshua chapter 1. He's the guy who is going to carry them over the Jordan into the promised land. Question, did God keep his promise? Oh, you better believe it. He gave them the land. Those 12 tribes, they went over. If you look in Joshua chapter 4, you remember they built those memorial stones as a symbol to future generations of what God did for them. And then he starts handing them the land. They battle at Jericho. What happens? Walls come down. They go to a place called Ai. What happens? City is completely demolished. City after city after city, God says, "I'm going to give it to you." And he does. So picture in your mind for just a moment. All of what we call the promised land is filled up with these 12 tribes. They each have their own distinct territory. God gives them judges. Everything's going great until they decide, we don't want judges. We want king. God says you don't want a king. Because if you have a king, your children will end up serving that king. He will take the best of your land, the best of your crops. What'd they say? Give us a king. We want to be like other nations. You can translate that this way. We want to be like the world. Take a look at the very last verse of the book of Judges. Judges chapter 21, verse 25. In those days there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. God says, okay, you want a king? I'm going to give you a king. And if I were to list them this evening, I suspect most of you in here could probably remember some of them. Like, for instance, Saul. Remember him? David. Remember who was next? Solomon. Then, this is when it starts getting hard. Rehoboam. Okay, here's where I want everybody in here to kind of put a mental bookmark. It was under Rehoboam that those 12 tribes actually split into a divided kingdom. 10 of those tribes went north. They formed the nation of Israel. They had 19 kings, every single one of which was evil. You open your Bible to 1st and 2nd Kings, and what you are reading is about how horrible these men are. In fact, they are so bad that God sends prophets like Elisha, Elijah, Amos, Hosea, Isaiah. He sends them to the northern kingdom of Israel to call them back. And yet, many of you in this room, you know their faith. 722 BC, God said, I am done with you. And He gave them over to the Assyrians. Now, folks, think about this for just a moment. This was His promised people in His promised land. And yet He said, I'm done with you. All right, what about the southern kingdom of Judah? Remember I told you they split. They split into two nations, Israel, Judah. Judah was formed up by the remaining two tribes, Benjamin and Judah. They also had 19 kings, most of which we would call evil today. There were some good ones. There were men like Josiah who tried to restore the law. But as you're reading through the Bible, 1st and 2nd Kings, you know what you keep running into? You keep running into phrases like, they didn't tear down the high places. You know what that means? They allowed anything. So God sent men like Jeremiah. He sent men like Ezekiel and Daniel down to the southern kingdom of Judah to call them back. And yet again, most of you in here know their fate. 606 BC, they were given over to the Babylonians. Now you look at me and you say, okay, Brad, why the history lesson? Well, take a look. It took 213 years for God to literally give up His chosen people in Israel. It took 349 in Judah. I think the only reason they lasted longer was because they did have a few good leaders in there. But again, folks, His chosen people in His chosen land. And yet He says, I'm done with you. Here's my question. As you look at those 2 years, ask yourself, how old is the United States of America? I'll give you a hint. We fall quite literally right between those 2 days. We declared our independence in 1776, didn't we? So the obvious question would be, all right, what then determines the course of a nation? I mean, why would God give these people up? Oh, we go home tonight, we turn on our television, we turn on the news, and lo and behold, they are very happy to tell us what they think determines the course of a nation. They tell us about things like healthcare or the economy. Do we ever hear about those kinds of things on the news? Here's a question. Jesus Christ comes back tomorrow. How many of the things on the screen behind me actually matter? None of them. Folks, if you want to know what determines the course of the nation, the Bible tells you it is how a nation respects and obeys Jehovah God. Ask yourself as you're sitting here, has there been any nation that rises to power, that snubs its nose at Jehovah, and is able to stand? Not in history, there's not. Let's learn from two men. Turn in your Bible, 2 Kings. 2 Kings chapter 16 is where we're going to start. I want you to remember these two guys. In fact, if you will, do a little homework, study up on them. The first king is a guy by the name of Ahaz. Remember that name, Ahaz. The text says, walked according to the abominations of the nations whom the Lord had cast out from before the children of Israel. Notice that word right there. Abominations. The fool has said in his heart, there is no God. They are corrupt. They have done abominable works. The second name we pick up in 2 Kings chapter 21. Verse 2, we read about a guy by the name of Manasseh. This is another king who did evil in the sight of the Lord according to the, there's that word again, abominations of the nations whom the Lord cast out from before the children of Israel. Folks, if you are here tonight and you want to know why would God give up His chosen people in His chosen land, the Bible tells you they were committing abominable customs. Now you look at me and you say, okay, Brad, exactly what were they doing? There's the short list. They were committing idolatry. Now, we look at that today in the year 2011 and we say, don't have to worry about that because I don't have any little statues of Buddha on my mantle. Question. Are there other forms of idolatry? Like, did Paul mention in Colossians 3:5 that covetousness is a form of idolatry? He did. Adultery. Moms and dads, as you look at that word up there, I want to remind you of something. Your children are being trained at your feet. And if you allow them to watch television shows that glamorize infidelity, don't be surprised when their marriages fail. They were committing homosexual acts. They had bad judges, immoral practices. They were using mediums. Now again, we look at that and we think, no big deal. I'm not calling up the psychic connection. All right, so I thought about it. That was like $10 a minute. Here's a question. What's the most highly read portion of the daily newspaper? You realize in many cases we're reading the horoscopes with more regularity than we read this book? They were killing children. They were actually offering their children up to the fires of Molech. Now, folks, as you look at that list, the $64,000 question should be running right through the front of your mind, and that is, any of those behaviors sound like us today? You see, folks, the Bible says we're known by our fruits. And if a nation decides to turn its back on God, we're going to start to see that fruit, aren't we? Take a look, 2 Chronicles chapter 28. Remember I told you, don't forget a king by the name of Ahaz. Here's why I didn't want you to forget. Because the Bible peels back the curtain and it tells us a little bit more about why God would turn His back. Take a look. The Lord brought Judah low because of Ahaz, king of Israel, for he encouraged moral decline in Judah. We backed up. And being continually unfaithful to the Lord. He encouraged moral decline. Are we encouraging moral decline today in America? Well, let's see. We're now offering birth control to first graders. First graders, folks. Oh, and if that wasn't bad enough, we have books that are basically teaching transgenderism to kids 4 to 8 years of age. But don't worry, if that's a little bit too old for your child or your grandchild, it's okay, because we got books now that go all the way down to 2 to 4-year-olds. You see, folks, these 2 books on the screen behind me, they were the first of 9 that have been sent free of charge to every public elementary school. Listen to me, including here. I've got 7 of them in my office. Free charge. Now, I want you to imagine your child, your grandchild, going down having library time. I'm going to read you a couple of pages out of this one. Understand, I didn't scan the whole book, because quite literally I can't stomach the whole book. But I want you to imagine your child, your grandchild goes down, they open up the book, the librarian starts to read, my mommy and daddy got a divorce last year. Now there's somebody new at daddy's house. Mommy says daddy and Frank are gay. First, I didn't know what that meant, so she explained it. Being gay is just one more kind of love. And love is the best kind of happiness. Daddy and his roommate are very happy together. And I'm happy too. Is that wicked? To plant that in the heart and the mind of a child? It's all over the place. You walk into a Barnes & Noble. You walk by, you see a sign like this that says thought-provoking. I actually took this picture. I stopped, I looked, lo and behold, every single one of the books is promoting atheism. But it's not just things like that. What about when our kids get online? Maybe they're doing some research for a research paper. They stumble across a website like the Rational Response Squad. Now that sounds like a good thing. Until you read the subheading that says, believe in God? We can fix that. You see, out of all the topics that we're discussing, there is no question of greater importance than whether or not there really is a God. Because everything else that we're going to talk about hinges on this. If there really is a God, then you are here for a reason. Your life has purpose. If there is no God, listen to me. We're just a result of a cosmic explosion. And you might as well eat, drink, and be merry. Now, one of the things you're going to learn about me this weekend is I'm not a math guy. But I want to share with you a word equation to make my point right here. And I think you'll see what I'm saying. Only bodies in which a component is eternal and endless can have meaning. In other words, only bodies that have a spirit that goes on after death can have meaning. Why would you say that, Brad? Because if you're dead all over like Rover, your life doesn't have any meaning. Because once you go in the ground, you're done. Number 2, if there are no gods, there aren't any endless lives. Because it takes a God to instill a soul. Number 3, if there is no God, then lives don't have meaning. Now, you may not like my math, but that doesn't change the equation. Folks, think about it for just a moment. The way in which we answer these questions, the questions of life. Where did I come from? Why am I here? Where am I going when I die? The way that we answer those is largely determined by our worldview. Now, I understand there's lots and lots of worldviews out there. Realistically, there's only 2. There's a biblical worldview and there is a secular worldview. And by that I mean this. A biblical worldview analyzes everything through the lens of God's Word, or through God's Word and His presence, His existence. Secular worldview says this. You know what? Time Magazine told me this last week, CNN told me that, and my textbooks told me this, and secular worldview analyzes everything through the world. As you look at those 3 questions up there, ask yourself what our kids are being taught in the public school system. Oh, you don't have to ask yourself. I've got pictures I'm going to show you this weekend. But I'll go ahead and tell you this. There's only one worldview that's being presented in the classroom, and it has nothing to do with a God. You say, okay, Brad, how do you know there really is a God? I was sitting in a coffee shop with an atheist one time. I get a chance a lot of times to study, to kind of converse with him. We're sitting there, good guy, very nice man. He smiled at me and said, okay, Brad, give it your best shot. Give me your best evidence for God. I looked at him, I smiled, took my shoe off, plopped it on the table. I said, there's your proof right there. And he looked at me kind of like you guys are. He said, what are you talking about? I said, my shoe. I said, my shoe is proof for God. He said, how do you figure that? I said, well, my shoe could have only come from one of three places. Either my shoe is eternal and it's always been here, option one, or my shoe is not eternal, but rather it just popped into existence. One day I'm walking around in sock feet and there's 11 and a half right there. Or number three, it was created. He laughed at me. He said, now we can look at your shoe and tell it's not eternal. It's wearing down. I said, you're right. He said, I'm not dumb enough to think that it just popped into existence from nothing. I said, you're right again. He said, obviously your shoe was created. I said, okay, now let's talk about the shoemaker. And about that time, he got this look on his face like, uh-oh. Because he realized you can follow this all the way back, folks, to the very existence of the universe. The fact that we have matter today means that it had to come from somewhere. Why do I say that? Because, folks, it is a self-evident truth that you cannot get something from nothing. You know what that means? That means we just proved that something out there is eternal. You know, Richard Dawkins, very well-known atheist, he loves to beat Christians over the head and say, where did God come from? That's his favorite crutch. It's an argument we call an argument ad infinitum, meaning it would go on forever. Because if I tell Richard Dawkins, God came from X, what's he going to say? Where'd X come from? Folks, listen to me. Richard Dawkins is not intelligent enough to understand and comprehend the concept of eternality. He doesn't get the fact that matter exists today, which demands that something has been here forever. I was having another conversation with a different atheist. You'll love this one. He's sitting there, and I'm trying to get him to explain to me his belief about the Big Bang. So I asked the guy straight out, I said, so just tell me where everything came from. He said it came from nothing. So I paused, I smiled, I said, okay. You're telling me everything came from nothing? He said, absolutely. I said, then the Big Bang, what actually exploded? He didn't miss a beat. He looked straight at me, he said, nothing. I said, hold on. You're telling me nothing exploded, and from that we got all of this? He said, absolutely. I said, buddy, I don't have enough faith to be an atheist. Because think about it. We have never, ever seen all of this come from nothing. But that's his only option. When you look at the evidence, you realize something exists today, right? That means something has existed forever. That's a problem. Because now we have something that is eternal. You know what science says? Science says everything is wearing out. Everything is running down. Number two, something is eternal. Therefore, it violates scientific laws. Number three, something violates scientific laws, thus it exists outside of the observable laws of naturalistic science. Again, you may not like that math, but that doesn't change the very real fact. So as you're thinking about that and thinking about your children, as you're thinking about your grandchildren, as you're thinking about the school system here in this community, ask yourself, which worldview have we really adopted? Now, I told you that there's two different ones. Basically, we've either got a biblical worldview or we've got a secular worldview. You say, Brad, break that down for me a little cleaner. Let's take a look. If you really have a biblical worldview, when it comes to the topic of truth, ultimately you know that real truth comes from God, period. Listen to me. It doesn't matter what your opinion is. It doesn't matter what your grandmother believed. Truth comes from God. if you've got a biblical worldview when it comes to man, even though you know you're going to get one of those Time magazines that's got some Neanderthal-like creature on it, folks, if you've got a true biblical worldview, you know that man was created in the image and likeness of God, and that magazine is rubbish, and hopefully that's where you put it. Number 3, if you've got a true biblical worldview when it comes to ethics, you know that ultimately whatever God deems as good is good. It doesn't matter what you think. It doesn't matter what makes you feel good. Number 4, universe. If you've got a true biblical worldview, you know the universe was created by God. A couple of reasons. Number 1, declare His glory for signs, for seasons. And last but not least, when it comes to wisdom, you know true wisdom comes from Jehovah. Now let's look at that other side for just a moment. Secular worldview. It comes to the topic of truth. If you've got a secular worldview, basically you're thinking there is no such thing as absolute truth. You've got your truth and I've got mine. You've got your truth based on your environment, your living conditions, and I've got mine. And listen to me, moms and dads, grandparents, if you are sitting in this room and you're thinking to yourself, surely there's nobody out there that thinks that. You need to understand our kids are being indoctrinated with this idea right here. I was teaching 11th grade class, and I was throwing out some founding fathers to them. Thomas Jefferson, Abraham Lincoln, George. And I had a young man about 3 rows back. He kind of raised his hand. He said, "We don't know they existed." I looked over at him. I said, "Excuse me?" He said, "Yeah, we don't know those guys even were real." All of a sudden, his classmates started echoing him. They said, "Yeah, we don't know any of those guys were real." And by now, I'm thinking I'm warped into the Twilight Zone. This young man, emboldened by his classmates, he sticks out his chest. He says, "We can't know anything for sure." To which I just walked over to it, and I pinched him as hard as I could. And when he said, "Ow!" I said, "How do you know that that hurt?" Completely drunk the Kool-Aid. I mean, number 2, you've got a secular worldview. You believe that man evolved from some ape-like creature. Whether it's Lucy, Neanderthal man, Homo habilis, we're going to touch on those tomorrow. Ethics. If you've got a secular worldview, you basically think, you know what? If it makes me feel good, I'm doing it. You think the universe was a product of a cosmologic explosion. And finally, when it comes to wisdom, you believe truly that wisdom comes from some guy with a lot of initials after his name. Now, here's the problem that I see. I see many parents trying to instill this column right here in their kids. And then I see their kids running off to college, and within one short semester, all they're getting is this right-hand column. So you know what our kids are trying to do? They're basically trying to take a funnel. And they're basically trying to funnel the concept of God into a secular worldview. Because after all, they know mom and dad believe in God, and they've been to worship every single Sunday since they were little. And let me tell you something, folks. It ain't happening. Because if there really is a God, there's truth. If there really is a God, we were created for a purpose and a reason. So here's what I want to do. Before we prove there's a God, I want to give you 6 Bible verses that I hope you'll write down. 6 Bible verses that will help prove a biblical worldview in the heart and mind of your children, your coworker, your neighbor, your friends. 6 Bible verses that will basically help establish where we're going this weekend. That's going to kind of give us a feeling for what is the real age of the earth. Let's start right here. Genesis chapter 1, verse 1. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Folks, if you can't trust the first verse of the Bible, Why would you trust anything to follow? Moms and dads, listen to me. If you compromise the opening chapters, don't you be surprised when your children compromise the closing chapters. You say, okay, Brad, that's nice and all, but the Bible doesn't exactly say when was the beginning. Maybe it was billions of years ago. Well, let's keep looking. Colossians chapter 1, verse 16. Paul here, writing to the church at Colossae, he says, for by him were all things created that are in heaven, that are in the earth. Paul indicating that it is a creation event and that God created everything in heaven and in earth. Verse number 3. Matthew chapter 19, verse 4. He answered, he said to them, have you not read that he which made them at the beginning made them male and female? Now, let me remind you, this is Jesus Christ speaking here. Telling you that men and women have been here, notice this, at the beginning. In fact, look how he phrases it in Mark chapter 10, verse 6. But from the beginning of creation, God made them male and female. Time out right here. We got a problem. Because my kids' textbooks are saying this earth is 4.6 billion years old with a B. And the man has only been here for 3 to 5 million years. And yet, Jesus Christ is saying, we've been here from the beginning of creation. We got a problem. Wouldn't it be nice if he named that first male for us? Which he does. 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verse 45, so it is written, the first man, Adam, was made a living soul. The last Adam was made a quickening spirit. Who's the first Adam he's referring to there? That's not a trick question. Adam of Adam and Eve. Who's the second Adam? That's Jesus. My point being, folks, you dismiss the first one as a myth or a fable. What are you doing to the second one? Because Paul's referring to both of them historically. The last verse I would give you is Genesis chapter 3, verse 20. Adam called his wife's name Eve because she was the mother of all living. Now, with those 6 Bible verses in hand, here's what you are able to do. You can sit down with your friends, you can sit down with your children, your grandchildren, your co-workers. Open your Bible to Genesis chapter 5. That passage that everybody in here loves the most. So-and-so begat so-and-so. If I'm going to teach this the way that I do it, you guys can already tell I'm a visual learner. I think you can learn a lot from both hearing and seeing, right? So if I'm going to do it, I build a timeline. I open the Bible up to Genesis chapter 5 and I read, Adam lived 130 years. He begot a son. He called his name Seth. So we drop 130 on this timeline and then we keep reading. Seth lived 105 years. He begot Enosh. We add 105 to that, we're up to 235, and we keep reading. Enos lived 90 years. He begat Canaan. We add 90 to that, we're up to 325. And check this out. Suddenly, we can actually build a timeline that is telling us the age of this earth. You say, whoa, time out. How can you say that? Because in the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. It was a creation event. There were males and females here from the beginning. First male's name, he's just giving you his lineage. You say, whoa. Surely there's like gaps or holes in those genealogies. You don't expect us to think, do you? Take your Bible, let's turn to the New Testament book of Jude. I was at a youth camp last week in Oklahoma. I told them, I said, turn to Jude chapter 3. There's only one chapter in Jude. Take a look with me at verse 14. Where the text talks about Enoch being the seventh from Adam. So we've got an inspired New Testament writer telling us that Enoch is the seventh, correct? We turn back to our chart, or we look in Genesis 5. Lo and behold, guess what? There's Enoch. And he's the seventh. Telling me, if you're going to put gaps or holes in these genealogies, it's going to have to come after Enoch. And folks, listen to me. There's not enough gaps or holes in the world to fit evolutionary time into this thing. Let me show you something some of you in this room have never even thought about. Vertical line that that I'm dropping right here, do you realize everybody to the left of that line could have had a face-to-face conversation with Adam? Because they were living as contemporaries. Check this out. That's Lamech. That's Noah's dad. Could have looked Adam in the face and said, what was it like in the garden? But to me, the one that's even more impressive, keep your eye right here. This is Noah. I'm going to slide him up to the top. So we got Noah right here, his son Shem. You realize everybody to the left of that arrow could have had a face-to-face conversation with Shem about what it was like in the pre-flood world? You're now talking about people like Abraham and Isaac. Could have looked him in the face and said, what was it like? Folks, listen to me. If we are going to teach our children a correct biblical worldview, the way we do that is we start with Jehovah God, creating a man by the name of Adam, and they go all the way to us today. In fact, if you take a look, right here is Abraham. You'll notice right after Abraham, it's got some numbers. 21, 23. That is the number of years since creation. 21, 23. Now, here's an interesting question. It's 2,123 years, approximately, from here to here. Wouldn't it be nice if we knew the amount of time from Abraham to Christ? I mean, we can get from Adam to Abraham. Wouldn't it be nice if we could get from Abraham to Jesus? Which we can. In fact, we can not only get there, we can get there either through Mary or Joseph. Take your pick. Folks, it's not a mistake that we've got those genealogies in the Bible. Take a look. It's 2,000 years from Adam to Abraham. Round numbers, it's also another 2,000 years from Abraham to Christ. You say, no, it can't be because there's a whole lot more people there. How long do people live up here? A whole lot longer, didn't they? So you've got 2,000 years from here to here. Roughly 2,000 years from here to here. Do we know how long it's been from Christ to us today? Round numbers, 2,000 years. We're living in the year 2011 AD. AD actually stands for in the year of our Lord. Which is why our children are learning new designations in their textbooks. They're learning CE. That would be Common Era. Or BCE, before Common Era. Here's the funny thing. I don't care what letters you put on it. It still has to hinge around a zero date of what? When Jesus Christ was on the earth. You look at me and you say, but Brad, man, I hear what you're saying, but this stuff's got to be older than that. I mean, have you looked at the rocks lately? Here's my question for you. What does a young rock look like? Are they wearing diapers or what? My job, and I love my job. You are going to realize I'm one of those sick people that really loves my job. My job for the rest of the weekend is to show you how the science fits with the Bible. Our kids are hearing that it's science versus the Bible. That's rubbish. God's the author of science. Real science points back to it. So let's take a few minutes tonight and let's look at 7 easy ways that we can prove there really is a God. And think about it. If I were an atheist and I walk down this center aisle and I look all of you in the face and I say, okay, I'm an atheist, your sign out front says Church of Christ, you got 20 minutes. Prove to me. Can we do it? And if you all are sitting in this room right now thinking, well, it's all right, I'll get the preacher or an elder, that's no good, because if you can't prove it, how do you expect your kids to? Because, folks, let me tell you what. They know there's a battle going on because they've already started fighting. I grabbed this off of an atheistic website. Take a look at it. It says, no God, no guilt. The belief in God awakens fanaticism and guilt. Live free and responsible. De-baptize yourself. Which I'm assuming involves a hairdryer. I don't know. That's somebody tell me, no, that's the thing at the end of the car wash. The blowers. I don't know. But folks, think about it for just a moment. If I asked you, do you know for certain that Abraham Lincoln lived? Anybody in here actually see it? Nope. Or for those of you who have never been overseas, how do you know for sure that there really is a Great Wall of China? And you say, well, Brad, wait a second, time out. We've got pictures of Abraham Lincoln. We've got his writings. We can get in our car, go to Kentucky to his childhood home. We got proof that Abraham Lincoln lived. And as for the Great Wall of China, folks, you put me on a computer that has Wi-Fi, I can be looking at it in 3 minutes from a satellite. We got proof. But let's be honest. God is a spirit. The Bible tells us those who worship Him must worship Him in spirit and in truth. Okay, big red flag should have just popped up in most of your minds, and that is this. Our kids are learning something called the scientific method. And basically the scientific method goes like this. You've got to be able to walk into a lab and either see it, taste it, smell it, touch it, or hear it, repeat your findings, and only then is it considered real. They've been learning this since they were about this big. They don't even know, most of them, that it's called the scientific method. Okay, here's the question. Where does that put God? So what we're going to do is we're going to look at 7 ways that you can prove He's real. Our kids need to understand the scientific method, while it sounds good in the textbook, realistically, it's miserable science. And here's why. One reason why. There's several reasons. They tell our kids that everything out there should be measurable. Okay? Let's think about that for just a moment. Do you realize the whole process of coming up with an experiment is not measurable? How does that scientist know what he's going to do? Do you realize that if the scientific method basically controlled everything, here's what a scientist would do. He would walk into his lab and stand there. Because he has to put thought and bias and personality and opinion and all of this stuff that I'm naming is not a part of the scientific method. 7 ways we can know there's a God. Number 1, every creation must have a creator. Again, we have never seen an exception to this. You look at Hebrews chapter 3, verse 4, for every house is built by someone, but He who built all things is God. All things were created through Him and for Him. Colossians 1:16. The easiest way to prove that there really is a God is you walk outside with your children on a clear night, you point up to the night sky and you say, hey, where did all that come from? Because your kids can see the moon. They can see the stars, and it goes back to those 3 options that I was just giving you. You remember my shoe? I said it's either eternal or it just popped into existence from nothing, or it was created. Now, as you look at those 3 options, you can go ahead and count the first one off. It's no good. It is unscientific. The 2 guys that proved that, Albert Einstein and Edwin Hubble, they showed that the universe is expanding. It had a beginning. There's not an honest scientist in the world today that will say, okay, yeah, it's eternal. We know that's garbage. So that leaves us with only 2 options. Now, if you're an atheist, you don't like option number 3. That's why my friend was telling me everything came from nothing. Now, they don't say that in textbooks because our kids would laugh at that. They said, they realize that'd be ridiculous. So what they do is they tell our kids it came from an incredibly dense, little bitty point in space that was about the size of a proton. Where'd the proton come from? Furthermore, is it logical to think that all the mass in this room came from a proton? A better option is that it was created. A logical option. Folks, think about that for just a moment. You want to prove there's a God? Just walk outside and look at the stuff. I asked one guy one time, he said, absolutely there was a Big Bang. I said, okay, who pulled the trigger? He said, what do you mean? I said, who pulled the trigger for the bang? Who lit the fuse? We know that, I bumped the table. Sorry about that. We know that matter exists, so where did it come from? So the very first way, every creation must have a creator. Number two, every design must have a designer. Folks, I don't care how you look at it, design demands a designer. I was doing a debate in New Zealand with an atheist. 3-hour televised debate. Right in the middle of the debate, I set him up. I started asking him questions that I knew he couldn't answer. His name was Dr. Joe. I said, Dr. Joe, could you tell the audience out there exactly where the original matter for the universe came from? He kind of hung his head. He said, we don't know that for sure. I said, that's okay. Maybe then you could tell us how we went from non-living gas and rock to the first living cell. He hung his head. He said, we don't know that either. I said, no worries. How about this one? Could you tell us how that first cell self-assembled? Because science says everything's going towards chaos. How do you get everything together? I kid you not. By this time, he's looking at his feet. Don't know. So that's all right. Could you tell me what that first cell ate? I asked him 2 or 3 more questions like that. I kid you not. He's staring at his feet. And then I switched gears on him. And I said, hey, Dr. Joe, you ever heard of the brachial plexus? It's a nerve plexus. Sits right under your armpit. Looks like a big spider web. It's huge. It's one of the biggest nerve plexuses in your bodies. He perked up and said, absolutely. Yeah, I've seen it. I said, so you've actually seen this nerve plexus? He said, yes. Sticks his chest out. He said, I've even done surgeries on it. I said, so you've seen the design firsthand in this nerve plexus? He said, absolutely, I've seen the design. And as soon as that left his lips, he realized what he just said. Folks, anytime you get design, you've got to have a designer. If I asked you, do we have design in the human body or design in the universe? Absolutely. Again, I'm not a numbers guy, but take a look at this. We're going to look real quickly at the odds of getting a heavenly body in just the right place in space. What are the odds, for instance, of being in the right type of galaxy? 1 in 7. But not only do you have to be in the right type of galaxy, you got to be in the right location within that galaxy. Not too far out of one of those spiral arms or too close to the center. The odds are 0.05 to the 5th billion. What about being near the right age sun? That's one that's not flaming up or flaring out. The odds are 1 in 100. The odds of being the right distance from that sun is 1 in 40. The right rotation rate, 1 in 4. The right tilt, 1 in 360. You add all these numbers up. The number you see at the bottom, that is the statistical odds of putting a heavenly body in just the right place in space. Now, I would point out, folks, number 1, that's statistically impossible. Number 2, you don't have life yet. All you got is a ball in space. You still got to add things like water. Think about it. What about the sun? Has it occurred to you? The sun's not exactly like an air conditioning unit that you can just go up and flick the switch. You know, one of the things that we don't like to talk about in the church, I travel about 42 weekends a year. I go all over, and there's, in every congregation I go to, there's a fight that's kind of going on. We don't like to talk about it in the church much. We don't like to air out our laundry, and I suspect it's probably going on here. That fight has to do usually with a little box that's on the wall. And usually some poor soul, usually a gentleman, deacon maybe, somebody has control of that box. He's got 1 of 2 choices. He can make the ladies happy and the guys burn up. Or he can make the guys happy and the ladies cold. Folks, have you thought about the fact that the sun is 93 million miles away and God set the temperature perfect for life on this earth? Are we really to believe the Earth's atmosphere, the tilt, the rotation, the distance of the moon, distance from the sun, the Earth's orbit, placement of the galaxy, that all of that is just a product of chance? Because that's what they're getting in their textbooks. the human body? Do we see design in the human body? I got a doctorate in anatomy and neurobiology. Probably have dissected well over 600 or 700 human bodies. Folks, you cannot cut open a body without seeing phenomenal design. And I do mean phenomenal. You've got a lymphatic system, a nervous system that makes 3G wireless look like child's play. You've got an arterial system. You've got an immune system, a reproductive system, a digestive system, and it goes on and on and on. Psalm 94 verse 9, he who planted the ear shall he not hear, and he who formed the eye shall he not see. Proverbs 20 verse 12, the hearing ear, the seeing eye, the Lord has made them both. Design demands a designer. Number 3, codes require somebody to program the code. Now we know that, we understand that, but we don't really get it. Carl Sagan, very well-known atheist, died several years ago. He had a show called Cosmos. And on his show, he made a statement one time. He said, if we ever detect a code from outer space, that demands that there's life out there. Intelligence, he said. And so what do? We have spent untold millions of dollars in the SETI program to search for extraterrestrial life, to find that code in space. And yet, all the while we're looking, folks, listen to me, every single one of you have a code in every cell of your body. It took us 13 years to unravel the code. It's called DNA. Hundreds of labs participated, millions of dollars. 2 questions. Number 1, where did the parts for the code come from? Number 2, who programmed the code? You want to prove there's a God? The very essence of a code demands there's a programmer. Number 4, laws require a lawgiver. How do we prove there's a God? By the very presence of physical laws of nature. James chapter 4 verse 12, there's one lawgiver who's able to save and to destroy. We know that there are laws out there, like the law, for instance, of gravity. And we know about the law of momentum. Folks, you can't get a law without a lawgiver. How did they get there? Proof number 5. We're going to prove there's a God. Every material effect, there must be an adequate cause that existed prior to it. Get? Yep. Law, cause, and effect. Basically, if I were to tell you, hey, that little frog just caused a tsunami wave, you would say there's no way. That cause is not big enough to make that effect. All right, well, what caused the universe? And you say, whoa, what caused God? It goes back to that eternality thing, doesn't it? Nothing caused God because He's always been here. Proof number 6. We have a moral code. Where did the moral code come from? And folks, listen to me. I do talk to atheists quite a bit. This is one they cannot get around. Because one of the very first questions I will ask atheists is this. Would you mind if I come to your house, rob you blind, and kill your family? And for some reason they all say they don't want me doing that. You know what that means? That means they all recognize certain behaviors as wrong. You look up on the screen and you see all these different behaviors. Folks, listen to me. If we're saying that one thing is right and one thing is wrong, that means there has to be a standard. There has to be a yardstick that says, this is right, this is wrong. Where did the standard come from? This time you got 2 choices. Either A, it came from God, or B, it came from man. If you're an atheist, how many choices you got? Just one. Now think about that for just a moment. That means an atheist is stuck with the whole concept that man came up with ethics. What's wrong with that? Well, if I mention the name Hitler to you, Stalin, they ring a bell? What if they get to decide? Or for those of you who have teenagers in this room, how about we do this? How about we let the teens make all the choices for the next month? That be good? There'd be some... I heard some... Guys, the problem with saying that is that everybody would view right and wrong a little differently. I mean, think about it. evolution is about survival of the fittest, right? So let's say that Chris and I, we hear about a job that pays $500,000 a year, and all you got to do is test hammocks 8 hours a day. That's it. You just lay in hammocks 8 hours a day. Now, we both really want this job. He's got an interview tomorrow at 1. I've got one at 1:30. I'm nervous because he's got more experience than I do at it. So what do? About 11 o'clock, I go slit all 4 of his tires. What's the problem? I get the job. You say that's not right. Well, if we all evolved, it's certainly right. Survival of the fittest. The only option that makes logical sense is that mankind has adopted God's unchanging standard for right and wrong. We know, according to the Bible, He is eternal, He is holy, He is just and righteous, He is forever consistent. In fact, whatever He does, commands, or approves is ultimately for our good, period. The last way that we prove there's a God, communication requires a communicator. We have been duped by the media into thinking that all kinds of animals can talk and build on knowledge. They can communicate, absolutely, but do they build on knowledge? And by that I mean somebody says, hey, well, my parrot, it talks to me. Okay. Does your parrot teach its offspring not only to build a nest, but does the offspring say, you know what, I think I'm going to build an awning because I don't like getting wet. And then their offspring says, you know what, I think I want some central heat and air. And then their next offspring says, I think I'd like satellite TV. What do they keep doing? They just build a nest. You say, well, what are you talking about, Brett? Does anybody in this room honestly think that when Henry Ford built the first Model A, Model T, Model whatever, I wasn't here, do you think he envisioned airbags? Or a DVD player or GPS? My old car, I bought both sedan. Because the guy told me, he said, this is the safest car on the road. And I traveled quite a bit, and I thought, you know what, probably ought to invest a little bit. The guy spent 15 minutes, and I'm not exaggerating, telling me about all the safety features of this car. And he started pointing out all these airbags and air curtains and air windows. And he told me, he said, if this thing, something happens, you'll be completely encapsulated. I told my wife, I'm like, I want to go roll the car just to see that. Here's my point. Human beings are the only creatures that can build on knowledge like that. Folks, the Bible records that Adam named the animals before Eve was created. Some of you in this room may be looking at me saying, why does all this matter in the first place? It matters because the Bible presents man as intelligent from the beginning. Evolution, we've evolved our way up out of sludge, finally getting intelligence. Two totally different pictures. Creation says that man was the pinnacle of God's creation. We were the last and the best. Evolution says we started out of some primordial sludge, and after millions of years we've evolved our way up. There's a whole lot of difference in those two. Guys, when you look at the evidence, we got all kinds of proofs that He is real. We have proof that there is a God. Number one, we shouldn't be afraid to talk about it. And number two, if we don't teach our society, we are in grave danger. Because God, His long suffering is not going to last forever. Take a look. 2 Chronicles with me. 2 Chronicles chapter 7. Look with me at verse 14. If my people who are called by my name will humble themselves and pray and seek my face and turn from their wicked ways, then I will hear from heaven, I will forgive their sin, and I'll heal their land. That ought to be good news to folks in this room. because it's telling me that we're not too late. But we cannot go on allowing our society to think there is no God. Tomorrow night, we're going to look at some of the evidence for things like fossil man. Were we really created as an intelligent design? Or, what about Neanderthal man? What about Lucy? Our kids know them. They're in the textbooks. We're going to look at those dinosaurs. How do we explain the Bible and the dinosaurs? How do they fit together?